It began in 1927 with encouragement from Fritz and Dora Kuntz as a one-time camp for members of the Northwest Federation of Theosophical Lodges to gather for what was described as a rare spiritual vacation. Fred McLaren, a member of the Seattle Theosophical Lodge, and his wife Bessie offered their 28-acre Orcas Island property for a 2-week camp in the summer of 1927. Property visible here in a photo taken from the top of Mount Lookout in the late 30s. You can see the original farmhouse and the orchard. Describing that first year, Fritz said,
"It was all a mistake from beginning to end. We drove in the dusk, and when we arrived, we found the McLarens, the old house. They had no food, they were so poor. They got out of their best bed, such as it was, that we might be bedded down. I think there was a loaf of bread, and I tell you literally that's about all there was. And here we were. We had announced a young people's camp, an adult camp to follow it, and there was nothing. Nothing. Well, it was a very happy mistake, as it turned out."
Mistakes and all, 43 people came that first year and began to create traditions. They held an open-air discussion each morning in the meadow or at Madrona Point. They held a campfire each evening in the grove or at Madrona Point with music, talks, or poetry. The original seats in the grove were wooden benches and old car seats, as you can see in these photos. They also held a costume parade, with many of the costumes reflecting ideas expressed during discussions. That first year was so successful, the Northwest Federation leaders decided to hold a camp every summer. McLaren deeded the property to the newly created Orcas Island Foundation, in return for the foundation paying back taxes and the mortgage, and the camp was launched. The name Indralaya, Abode of Indra, was chosen by Fritz at that same time. Before the 1928 camp, attended by more than 80 people, McLaren and others built the warehouse, shown here in its current incarnation, a woman's bathhouse where our solarium now sits, and a new small kitchen building at the top of the hill where the resident manager's cottage is now. In this footage from the 1930s, you can see that folks walked up a ramp to the serving window, down the other side, and ate at open-air tables. If it rained, I presume they ate in the rain. Later, a dining platform was added to the front of the kitchen, and this was eventually roofed in the 1940s, as in this picture. Food came mostly from local farmers. Milk came in 5-gallon containers, all stored in an ice box, the kind with big chunks of ice delivered once a week. From the beginning, the campers shared the labor. Cooking, ditch digging, building, wood chopping, whatever needed to be done. In these old silent movies, you first see Gene Emmons cooking in the original kitchen, then the whole gang shelling peas during discussion. And finally, Cyril Torin and A.J. Harrison digging a ditch. The earliest accommodations were tents, on the ground at first, and then on tent platforms, like the one you see in the background here. Then in the late 30s, the campers built small cabins with roofs and screens for windows, but no heat, no door, no electricity. Both these photos were taken in the 50s, but the look of these cabins was much the same earlier on. The 3 cabins down by the waterfront, including the Kuntz cabin and Ocean Spray, then called the Emmons cabin, were also built during the 30s, as was the roundhouse. The original version of the teepee, and very importantly, the first water tank at the top of the hill, were also built in those early years, though the roof of that first teepee collapsed in the late 30s and had to be rebuilt. The farmhouse was also lost, to fire in this case, in the early 1940s. Those early campers, nearly all of them active theosophists, were astonishingly committed and determined. Some of the most vital people are shown here in a fine group portrait. From the left, Eloise Wardall from Tacoma, a gracious and beautiful woman. Ruby Page Ewer, a marvelously dramatic lady from Portland. Peter Roost, originally from Holland, who was a regular speaker at campfires. Ray Wardall, husband of Eloise, an attorney from Tacoma who served as the board chair for 2 decades. Fritz Kuntz, founder and inspiration to so many. Gene Emmons from Tacoma, who continued to be involved for more than 40 years as board member, cook, builder, and generous donor. And A.J. Harrison from Vancouver, who was possibly the best punster in the world, with Gene Emmons a close second. Not in this photo, but equally important, were Viva Emmons, who was camp manager for several summers in the 1930s and who sang at many campfires, and Dora Kuntz, who was one of the spiritual leaders of the camp from the earliest days. Also present in the 1930s were a number of young people who would play important roles in the decades ahead. Austin B., who served as camp manager from 1936, at age 22, to 1952. John Torrin and Cyril Torrin, who both spent extra weeks at camp in the 30s helping to build the early buildings. Dorothy Abbenhouse, then Enoch, shown here with Cyril, a young theosophist from Canada. And 3 young men who came together for the first time in 1939 and played large roles in the years to come. John Abbenhouse, Art Lewalder, and Ted Anderson. John and Dorothy met at camp in 1939. Austin B. talked about those earliest years in this conversation recorded during family camp in 1997.
I think something ought to be said about coming here as a young person at the time the camp began. It's a very different world that we live in today than we had at that time. And this world here at Indralaya was even more primeval in a sense. Keep in mind, there's no electricity, there's no plumbing, except cold water to the kitchen, heated by a wood stove. Cooking was all done on a wood stove. When it got dark, you had candles or kerosene lamps. But we had to build the whole community. There was nothing to start with. And each day, in addition to our work projects, we had the morning discussions about the significant things of life. And we had a series of people who came here, mostly from the theosophical world, who gave us things to think about. And we talked about them when we were building cabins and whatever. Afternoons, we usually had a certain amount of time free when we were building something. And then we had in the evening, we had the campfires, as we've had for so many years. And there was music, and there was poetry, and there was limerick and poetry, writing, and then there was art projects during the day for the smaller children. But we had no telephone here. For years and years we had no telephone. You had to go to East Sound to make a telephone call. Most people didn't bring any radios here. They didn't have much in the way of radios. There was no television.
No newspapers.
Nobody brought newspapers. So we had an environment that was about as different as you could get from the world in which we had come. And it was a feeling about a community of people who loved doing what we were doing in this place. And it made an impression on me that has governed personally my whole life. What direction I've taken in my life, things I've done and am doing still to this day. So that's why it's important to me, and it's been my spiritual home as long as I can remember.
Camps were held every year except 1932 until World War II intervened from 1942 to 44, and then resumed again with a work camp in 1945 and then two two-week camps in 1946. Beginning in 1937, the camp's property also increased twice. In 1937, the board, in search of a more stable water system, purchased the 8 adjacent acres at a tax sale. On the map, this is the rectangular bump shown at the top. They bought the land because it had a spring on it, and that spring is still the core of the camp's water system. In 1944, the south 40 acres, with our beaches and forest trails, was added to the camp through a donation by Austin B. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, most of these early traditions continued. In most years, we held a 2 to 3 week camp, preceded by a work week called pre-camp, when the dishes, pots and pans, and mattresses, all stored in the roundhouse over the winter, had to be shifted to their designated places, cleaned and readied for the summer. In these decades, many of the same families came each year, so the children grew up together. Leewalders. Abbenhouse. Pym. Clemens. Vale. Van Gelder. Bees and others. The teenagers typically slept out in a hay pile or on the same old World War II mattresses we still use. Here are teens from the 50s. And some from the mid-60s. And others from the late 60s. And then when these teens grew up, many of them brought their own children. In those post-war years, we all ate together much as we do now, in the old dining room and then in the new one. Until the late 1970s, meals were served family style, with smaller dishes of food on each table served by waitresses who brought beverages and refills of food dishes. We switched to buffet serving in the 1970s. There were always morning discussions and conversations in the meadow. Fritz and Dora often led discussions when they were able to be at camp. On other mornings, the discussions were led by many other regular campers, including John Torrin, Will Ross, Ted Anderson, John Abbenhouse, Harry Van Gelder, and many more. Each year, on the middle weekend of the camp, or at the end of 2 weeks for a 3-week camp, we also had a parade. Evening campfire, too, was a fixture every day, often following a volleyball game. Music was an essential ingredient of those campfires, with group singing of rounds or with guitar, and very often piano music provided by Phyllis Roberts, playing on the old upright that we moved to the Grove each summer. And each summer, on the evening following the parade, we had a big production of special skits. Over the years, several operas were even written for the occasion, almost all of them dealing with the camp's perpetual water shortage. Here's an excerpt from the second opera, presented by the Tetrapolitan Copra Company, called The Bigger Drip. In those decades, the campers also built and rebuilt buildings, including the teepee, which has been through many changes, a new solarium in 1956, with funds donated by a lovely man named Mose, a new dining room in 1958, built mostly by Gene Emmons and his crew, and plumbed by Ken and Hilda Symes. The lounge was added in 1964. The smaller cabins that we still use were built a few at a time through the 50s and 60s, replacing the old doorless, heatless cabins. Much of this construction was supervised by John Abbenhouse, who became camp manager in 1952, remaining in that role until 1985. As in the early years, working together, cooking, building, washing dishes, or whatever, was integral to camp life. So many faces from those years, some still with us, many of them gone. John and Dorothy Abbenhouse, who have filled every conceivable role at camp. Margie and Roe Clemens from Portland, who both served on the board at various times. John, Cyril, and Margaret Torrin, probing minds, puns, laughter, and beauty combined. Marge Torrin, Cyril's wife, who became one of the best cooks the camp ever had, and later registrar. George and Dulcie Linton from Portland. Dulcie was chief cook for many years, and George, with Roe Clemens, designed many of our buildings. Ed and Sadie Vale from Seattle, who came with their 2 sons and later their 19 grandchildren. Viva Emmons, musician, organizer, cook. Gene Emmons, who built the current kitchen, served on the board, and was a primary donor whenever the camp was broke. Ken and Hilda Symes. Ken was the camp's volunteer plumber for decades, and Hilda was involved in both cooking and art projects. Will Ross, articulate and devoted theosophist, led many discussions. Florence Leewalder, on the right here, soup cook extraordinaire and mother of the vast Leewalder clan. And Pat Sullivan, on the left, a source of fun, creativity, and biting wit. Willa Mae Pym, who attended the first camp and nearly every other one, board member, registrar, program organizer. Hank Noonhouse from Victoria, a highly skilled carpenter who, among many other things, paneled the library. Harry Van Gelder, shown here with Don Krusner, was a frequent discussion leader and famous arguer. And another regular discussion leader, Ted Anderson. John and Phyllis Roberts, Phyllis who provided marvelous music and talent, and John who was, and still is, jack of all trades. Susie B., now Brady, artist and cook. Austin B. and Art Lewalder, shown here sitting on the steps of the old kitchen. Austin was camp manager until '52, and then board member, builder, archivist, and every other role. And Art Lewalder was one of many men who helped to build what we now have. Joan Ray, mother of Mark and Isis, and Joe Halleck, two of the many devoted theosophists who enriched the camp. Joe was the camp librarian for many years. Nan Tilley, an early camper who built Salal Cabin. Phoebe Lundwall, later Erickson, and then B., who brought both beauty and brains. Joy Mills, internationally known theosophist who loved Indralaya and came often to lead discussions. And the Kunzes, John, Fritz, and Dora, who were in many ways the intellectual and spiritual heart of the camp. It is impossible to exaggerate the remarkable devotion of these folks. As just one example, John Abbenhouse, John Roberts, Ken Symes, and George Linton were the stalwart core of men who would come to camp on weekends after winter storms to make repairs. Until 1968, camps were limited in length because the water supply was only good enough for 3 or 4 weeks. Even the addition of a 35,000-gallon storage tank, Tank B, was not enough. But in 1968 we built Tank C, which holds 100,000 gallons. That gave us enough storage to expand the camp beyond the 3 to 4 week limit. And then things changed a lot. At that same time, John and Dorothy Abbenhouse came to live at camp as the first resident managers. We built a new house for them and for later resident managers, finished in 1974. With the water problem solved, the summer camp was expanded to 7 and then to 9 weeks. In addition, important weekend programs were added in the spring and fall, and in 1981, 3 weeks of therapeutic touch programs, organized and run by Dora Kuntz and Dolores Krieger, were added to the June schedule. Family camps of many varieties were also created, with the most durable format begun in 1996. Connections Week was added in 2005 with a format more like the camps of the 50s and 60s. And of course, over these past decades, there have been myriad other programs on meditation and spiritual development, interfaith discussions, yoga, tai chi, basic theosophy, and much more, led by many remarkable teachers, only barely sampled by these photos. When the Abbenhauses retired in 1985, new resident managers brought their skills and devotion to the job. Linda Jo Pym, who had been coming to camp since early childhood. Robert Jasper, jack of all trades, who shared the camp with both Linda Jo and Edith Karsten. And here is Edith, longtime Theosophist and Indralayaite. Bill and Jill Ganschow. Elizabeth Johnson, of whom we have no photo. Ian Van Gelder and Jeannie Chamberlain, each for a brief period, and both now on the camp board. Richard Hill, also no photo, who shared the job for a year with Dan Doolin, who came to Indralaya from Wheaton. Chris and Roseanne Dolan and their son Zach. And then for 10 remarkable years, from 1996 to 2006, Miner and Leonie Van Gelder Lyle. Slowly, ever so slowly, the camp adapted to the modern world. The first computer for the registrar was purchased in 1985, programmed by Dave Christensen. The first telephone was added to the office a bit later, and the first paid staff in the 1990s, made possible by a wonderful bequest from John and Polly Verrill. But despite these changes and the major shift from a 3-week camp to 3 seasons of programs, some essential things have remained the same. Doing chores and working together is still a key ingredient of camp life. Families still come year after year, new families and younger generations of old families, strengthening bonds with each other and with Indralaya. We still make music and fun at campfire, at the beach, in the meadow, in the teepee. We continue to build new buildings and repair old ones. The original library building was finished in 1984. The addition completed this year. The roundhouse was torn apart and reconstructed in the mid-90s. The upper necessitatorium with a new septic system was added in 1987, and the new steps to the dock were constructed about 5 years ago. In the category of mostly invisible improvements, we added another new water tank, Tank D, and almost completely replaced the entire piping system in the late 90s, another improvement made possible by the generous bequest from the Verrills. In the midst of all this labor, we continue to be strengthened and sustained by this community of loving friends, as we have been from the beginning. And as has been true throughout our history, we form bonds with generations other than our own. Throughout it all, we experience and foster a spirit of reverence for the natural world. The constant thread through it all has been the remarkable, enduring dedication of so many people to the experiment in theosophical living that is Indralaya. People who have given their time, their skills, their ideas and questions, their dollars, and their devotion in full measure. They have come to dozens, if not hundreds, of work parties. They cooked meals, built buildings, cleaned cabins and scrubbed bathrooms, made music, chopped wood, and carried water. Profound thanks to all who have created and sustained Indralaya. Here, with apologies to any whose photos we did not have, are some of the people who have been critical to the camp over these 80 years, many of whom are still vital parts of the community. Dorothy Abbenhouse, John Abbenhouse and Art Lewalder, Austin B., Dora Kuntz, John Roberts, Ian Van Gelder, Deb Hartel, Roseanne Dolan, Brian Davies, David Torin, Rolf Erickson, Bill Kent, shown here with John Roberts, Kelly Bachman, Sheila Levy and Wendy Valentine, Phyllis Roberts, Mark Ray, Michael Van Gelder, Helen B., Karen Funt, Phoebe B., Ken and Hilda Symes, Sandy Detroit, Mitchell Herzog, shown here with Sandy at a board meeting, Harry Van Gelder, Willa Mae Pym, Marge Torin, Cyril Torin, John and Margaret Torin, Minor and Leonie Van Gelder Lyle, one of many camp boards, Rolf Erickson, Austin B., John Levy, John Abbenhouse, John Kuntz, Karen Funt, Margie Clemens, and Linda Shields, and Donna Erickson. And thank you to those who will carry this remarkable tradition into the future. May the story continue for another 80 years.
May the circle be open.